What's going on, everyone? Dots Gaming here, and today I'm bringing you guys a beginner overview to the Druid class in World of Warcraft, giving you an introduction to the class and some beginner setups that you can use to get used to the class and its mechanics. Now, this video does assume that you have a base understanding of World of Warcraft and are looking for more of a class introduction, so if you're watching this video and are also brand new to WoW as a game, I recommend checking out my WoW Complete Beginner Guide, which will teach you all of the non-class specific things that you need to know to get yourself started in WoW and better understand this video. But without further ado, let's get into today's video covering the Druid class. Druids in World of Warcraft are guardians of nature, utilizing natural and celestial energies in the heat of combat. Druids have the ability to shapeshift into various beasts to enhance their abilities in combat, giving them unmatched versatility on the battlefield. They can then use these different forms, as the combat situations call them, giving the Druids the tool to respond to almost any situation. The Druid class is the ultimate hybrid with a spec for each role. Druids have one ranged DPS spec, one melee DPS spec, one tank spec, and one healing spec. Balanced Druids call on the power of the Moonkin, utilizing the powers of the arcane and nature magic to deal damage to enemies at range. Feral Druids are the melee DPS spec, embracing the form of the cat to deal its damage with bites and bleeds. Guardian Druids take on the form of the bear to tank, using their incredible survivability to absorb damage and protect allies. Finally, Restoration Druids are the healers of the class, utilizing nature healing over time spells to heal allies and help them stay alive. The Druid's primary resource kind of depends on the specialization. Several of the Druid's base skills, like their heals and utility skills, will cost mana. However, many of their offensive abilities cost a different resource based on the shapeshift form. You use Astral Power while you're in Moonkin form, Rage in Bear form, and Energy or Combo Points while you're in Cat form. Combo Points, Astral Power, and Rage are all resources that you build up with certain skills and then spend on more powerful offensive or defensive abilities. Druids wear leather armor. They utilize intellect as their primary stat for restoration and balance, while using agility for feral and guardian. They can wield staves, daggers, one-handed and two-handed maces, fist weapons, polearms, and non-shield offhand items. Now, the following builds are going to be tailored towards new players looking to make your rotation as easy and straightforward as possible while adding as few additional skills to your action bar, primarily focusing on adding passive increases. If you're looking for something more advanced and focus on dealing just as much damage or healing as possible, I recommend checking out Icy Veins or Wowhead for their advanced setups that are more tailored towards in-game raids, Mythic Plus, and rated PvP. So starting off with the ranged DPS of the class, and that is going to be the Balanced Druid, with our first talent being Nature's Balance. Now, this talent makes it so that while you're in combat, you generate one astral power every 2 seconds. In addition, while out of combat, your astral power basically generates up to and then stays at 50 instead of going to 0, giving you astral power to spend the second you get into combat. Our next talent is going to be Wild Charge. Now, this gives us a versatile mobility tool, letting us leap forward, backwards to allies, or even to enemies based on our shapeshift form. Our next talent is going to be Guardian Affinity. Now, this talent has our Balanced Druid embrace the Guardian Druid spec as well, making us much tankier. Guardian Affinity gives us a passive talent that gives us 6% damage reduction, Thrash, which is a bleed that we can use while in bear form, Incapacitating Roar, which is an AoE CC that we can use while we're in bear form, and Frenzied Regeneration, which is an incredibly strong self-heal that we could also use while in bear form. Our next talent is going to be Mass Entanglement. Now, this gives us a really strong AoE root tool, allowing us to remove all enemies within 15 yards of our target for 30 seconds. Keep in mind, though, that damage may break this effect. Our next talent is going to be Star-Lord. Now, this passive talent gives us 4% haste for 15 seconds, stacking up to 3 times whenever we use Star Surge or Star's Fall, which are our astral power spenders. Gaining stacks does not refresh the duration of this buff, though, which is something to keep in mind. Our next talent is going to be Stellar Drift. Now, this talent increases our Starfall, which is our AoE Astral Power Spender, duration by 2 seconds, increases the damage by 15%, and allows us to cast spells while moving while the skill is active. Now, our next talent is going to be Solstice. Now, this talent makes it so that during the first 6 seconds of every eclipse, shooting stars will fall 300% more often. Eclipse is a passive that will be explained during the rotation section and is pretty heavily ingrained in the Balanced Druid's gameplay. Now, if you do choose to PvP on the Balanced Druid, here are going to be some talents I recommend, with the first one being Thorns. Now, this PvP talent gives you an active ability that makes it so that melee opponents who attack you will have nature damage reflected back at them for 12 seconds. Attackers will also have their movement speed reduced by 50% for 4 seconds. The next talent is going to be Moonkin Aura. Now, this passive talent makes it so that Star Surge grants 4% spell critical chance for up to 8 allies within 40 yards for 18 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. Our final talent is going to be Celestial Guardian. This incredibly strong passive makes it so that you take 10% less damage from spells and receive 20% increased healing while in bear form, combining really well with our Guardian affinity. Now, in terms of how to actually play the Balanced Druid, when dealing damage as a Balanced Druid, which is also known as a Boomkin for short, you need to make sure that you properly manage your Eclipse passive. This passive puts you into Lunar Eclipse when you use 2 Wraths, and Solar Eclipse when you use 2 Starfires, and these eclipses happen in alternation. Now, the Solar Eclipse is going to empower the Wrath, while a Lunar Eclipse will empower Starfire. Now, you want to start off a fight, though, with 2 Wraths to make sure you get into Lunar Eclipse, to increase the critical chance and reduce the cast time of Starfire. After you cast 2 Wraths, follow it up with the application of your dots, Moonfire and Sunfire. Afterwards, you're going to want to use Starfire to get up to 90 Astral Power and then dump all of your Astral Power into Star Surge for a big burst of damage on a singular target. You'll then use Starfire as your filler until Lunar Eclipse ends, and then end until you enter Solar Eclipse, which empowers your Wrath. You will then use Wrath as your filler until the Solar Eclipse ends, and then you enter Lunar Eclipse, and then you're going to go back to Starfire, since Starfire is now being empowered by the Lunar Eclipse, and you're just going to want to keep alternating kind of like that. Besides your Eclipse management, you're going to be working to maintain your Moonfire and Sunfire dots on your target, using Starfire and Owlkin Frenzy procs, all while spending your Astral Power on Star Surge in single target situations and Starfall and AoE. In terms of some offensive notes for the Boomkin, when you want to deal a big burst of damage, you're going to want to use Celestial Alignment, which gives you both Eclipse effects and 10% haste for 20 seconds. You're going to want to use Mass Entanglement or Entangling Roots to root problematic enemies in their place. You can also combine this with Solar Beam to silence enemies trapped in those roots. Typhoon can be used to push back and slow enemies. It's really helpful to move enemies in dungeons and raids into a more favorable position for your group. Now, in terms of some defensive notes, if you're going to take a big hit or taking a little bit too much damage, you're going to want to use Bark Skin, because this low cooldown ability reduces damage taken by 20% for 12 seconds. You want to utilize Bear Form if you're taking a lot of damage and need to make yourself tankier. You can use Mangle to generate Rage, to cast Iron Fur to give you extra armor. You could also use Frenzied Regeneration to give yourself a massive heal, but do keep in mind you don't really deal a whole lot of damage while you're in this form. You want to use Soothe to remove an Enraging effect from enemy. Enrage effect from an enemy, those were words. Cyclone is a really powerful CC that can remove a problematic enemy from a fight for 6 seconds, because during this time they can't deal or receive any damage or healing. Hibernate can be used to put a beast or dragon type enemy to sleep for a long period of time, but keep in mind the CC will break on damage. You do have access to stealth while you're in cat form, which can be useful to bypass enemies that you don't want to fight. Dash is a really good ability to move around the battlefield quickly, but do keep in mind this puts you in cat form where you are not as tanky or deal as much damage as a Balanced Druid. Stampeding Roar is a really powerful tool to give your party a big movement speed boost, having 60% faster movement speed for 8 seconds. Wild Charge can be used in a variety of ways based on what the situation calls for. Use it in caster form to lead back to an ally, cat form to get behind an enemy, or bear form to charge to an enemy and root them. Moonkin form will also have you leap backwards, while travel form will have you leap forwards. Use Remove Corruption to remove curses and poisons from your allies or yourself. And finally, use Innervate on a friendly healer to allow them to be able to cast their skills with no mana cost for a period of time. Now, in terms of some secondary stats, in terms of the priority, I recommend Mastery, followed by Haste, followed by Versatility, followed by Critical Strike. In terms of some Shadowlands specific information, I do recommend using the Night Fae Covenant. Keep in mind that at the time of making this video, this tooltip's a little incorrect. It's actually 16 spells, and basically what it does, because the tooltip here is really long and kind of annoying to read, but basically you fire off 16 Druid spells in like 4 seconds while you channel the ability, and it favors your current shapeshift form. So as a Balanced Druid, while we are in the Moonkin form, it's going to favor Balanced Druid ability. So it's really, really fun skill, hits very hard. And in terms of our recommended legendary, I recommend using Memory of the Balance of All Things. Now, moving into our next spec, one of my personal favorites, and that is going to be the Feral Druid, the great form of the cat, with the first talent being Sabretooth. Now, this talent makes it so that our Ferocious Bite, which is our main direct damage combo point spender, deals 20% increased damage and increases the duration of Rip, which is our main combo point dot spender, by 1 second per combo point spent. So it makes it easier to maintain Rip on our target while we use Ferocious Bite. Our next talent is going to be Wild Charge. Now, this gives us a versatile mobility tool, letting us leap forwards, backwards, to allies, or even to enemies based on our shapeshift form. Our next talent is going to be Balance Affinity. Now, this talent has our Feral Druid embrace the Balanced Druid specialization as well, giving us some extra offensive prowess. While we do gain movement, Moonkin form and some of the Balanced Druid skills, we don't really use them. We mainly take this talent for the passive bonus of increasing the range of all of our abilities by 5 yards, making it much easier for us to maintain uptime on our enemies. We also do gain Typhoon, which allows us to knock back and slow enemies, which does come in handy. Our next talent is going to be Mighty Bash. Now, this gives us some strong single target CC with a nice stun that lasts for 4 seconds and is usable in all shapeshift forms. Our next talent is going to be Soul of the Forest. Now, this talent makes it so that our finishing moves, or also known as the moves that like spend combo points, grant 5 energy per combo point spent and deal 5% increased damage. This helps our combo point spenders deal more damage and give us better energy sustain. Our next talent is going to be Brutal Slash. Now, this talent turns our Swipe, which is normally just like an AoE damage skill that builds combo points, into Brutal Slash. Now, while Brutal Slash is still a solid AoE skill like Swipe is, unlike Swipe, it's also amazing for single target. So it really gives us a good single target filler that's a bit cheaper than Shred, so we could use that and then go into Shred. But if you don't want the single target damage increase here and want to further increase the potency of your AoE, you can feel free to take Primal Wrath in this row instead, which is a combo point spender that applies Rip to all enemies within 8 yards. Our final talent is going to be Moment of Clarity. Now, this talent helps a ton with energy management on the Feral Druid. This gives us 30% more maximum energy. Moment of Clarity occurs 50% more often and can accumulate up to 2 charges, and the damage of our next Shred, Thrash, or Brutal Slash is increased by 15%. Now, Omen of Clarity has a chance to proc on auto attacks, making the skills that I just listed have their next cast free. So Moment of Clarity gives us more energy to work with, more frequent free skills to cast, and those free casts also increase the damage of our skills. It's just an amazing quality of life talent for the Feral Druid, especially in PvE. Now, in terms of some PvP talents for the Feral Druid, I would recommend the following, with the first one being Thorns. Now, this PvP talent gives us an active ability that makes it so that melee opponent to attack you will have nature damage reflected back at them for 12 seconds. Attackers will also have their movement speed reduced by 50% for 4 seconds. Our next talent is going to be Leader of the Pack. Now, this makes it so that while we're in cat form, we increase the melee and range crit chance of all raid members within 40 yards by 5%. In addition, allies with this buff will heal themselves for 4% of their maximum health when they critically hit with a melee or range attack, but this can occur more than once every 6 seconds. Finally, Ferocious Wound makes it so that when we're attacking with a 5 combo point Ferocious Bite, we reduce the target's maximum health by 5% for 30 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. Only one target can have Ferocious Wound active, though, at a time. Now, in terms of the rotation for Feral Druid, with the build that we have listed in this video, the rotation for Feral is actually pretty straightforward. With that being said, one thing to keep in mind with Ferals is a mechanic that's known as snapshotting. Now, the way that this works is that your bleeds will deal damage based on your stats when the bleeds were applied for their full duration. The damage just it doesn't update with your stats. The damage that your bleeds deal is based off of when you actually apply them to your opponent. But in terms of the rotation, you want to start in stealth and open up with a Rake to apply its bleed and stun your enemy. Rake's damage is also increased when coming out of stealth. You then want to use Thrash to get its bleed up, and then afterwards start using Brutal Slash to build combo points. When you're out of Brutal Slash charges, you want to swap to Shred instead. Now, when you hit 5 combo points, you want to use Rip at this point, so you'll have all 3 of your primary bleeds up. Afterwards, you're just going to want to keep using Shred and Brutal Slash to build combo points, spending them on Ferocious Bite. You want to reapply your Rake and Thrash as necessary to maintain their bleeds. Now, the only time you're really going to ever want to reapply Rip, though, is when its duration is at 7 seconds or less. Otherwise, you're pretty much going to be able to maintain it with Ferocious Bite thanks to Sabretooth. In an AoE situation, you will also automatically be applying Thrash to all your targets because it's an AoE, but you'll also want to apply Rake on as many targets as possible, with Rip primarily on your main target in those situations. Now, in terms of some offensive notes, when you want to deal big damage, use Tiger's Fury and Berserk to increase your damage and grant extra combo points on finishing moves. Tiger's Fury should also be used on cooldown to help generate extra energy and increase your damage, but make sure that when you use Tiger's Fury, it's not going to overcap your energy. Typhoon can be used to push back and slow enemies. It's really helpful to move dungeon and raid enemies into more favorable positions for your group. You want to use Mighty Bash or Maim to stun problematic enemies, taking them out of the fight for a short time. You also can use Skull Bash to interrupt important enemy casts. Now, when you spend combo points, you have a 20% chance per combo point spent to make your next Regrowth or Entangling Roots instant cast and usable in any form. So you're going to want to use whichever skill the situation calls for. In general, though, if you're kind of solo questing by yourself, you're going to be using this on Regrowth a lot because you'll basically be getting self-heals weaved into your rotation totally for free. Because Regrowth is a heal with a hot attached to it, while Entangling Roots is just a root. Now, in terms of some defensive notes, if you're going to take a big hit or just taking a little bit too much damage, you're going to want to use Bark Skin. This low cooldown ability reduces damage taken by 20% for 12 seconds. Now, if you're taking a lot of extra damage, use Survival Instincts. This reduces damage taken by 50% for 6 seconds. You want to utilize Bear Form if you're taking a lot of damage and need to make yourself tankier. You can utilize Mangle to generate Rage, to cast Iron Fur, to give you extra armor, but do keep in mind you don't really deal a lot of damage while you're in this form. You want to use Soothe to remove it in Rage from an enemy. Cyclone's a really powerful CC that can remove a problematic enemy from the fight for 6 seconds, but during this time they can't deal or receive any damage or healing. Hibernate can be used to put Beast or Dragonkin type enemies to sleep for a long period of time, but CC will break this effect. You do have access to Stealth, as I mentioned, as a cat, which is really cool because you can bypass certain enemies that you don't want to fight. Dash is really good to move around the battlefields quickly, and this does automatically put you into cat form, though, which is something to keep in mind. Stampeding Roar is a powerful tool to give your party big movement speed, giving them 60% increased movement speed by 8 seconds. Wild Charge can also be used in a variety of ways based on what the situation calls for. You can use it in caster form to leap back to an ally, cat form to get behind an enemy, bear form to charge to and root an enemy, moonkin form to leap backwards, or travel form to leap forwards. And then you finally use Remove Corruption to remove curses or poisons from yourself or an ally. Now, in terms of some secondary stats, I recommend Crit, followed by Mastery, followed by Versatility, followed by Haste. In terms of some recommended covenants, I recommend Night Fae personally. If you want to know what this big long tooltip does, the Balanced Druid section explains it. And then in terms of the recommended legendary, I recommend Memory of the Apex Predator. Now, in terms of the tank spec, the Guardian Druid, I recommend the following talents, with the first one being Brambles. Now, this talent gives us a few passive bonuses. It makes it so that we absorb and reflect a portion of the damage from each attack. In addition, while Barkskin is active, which is our short cooldown damage mitigation ability, the Brambles deal extra damage to all nearby enemies every second. We primarily take this ability for the damage it deals, as it deals the most damage of any talent on this tier. And this is really important for Guardian Druid, since in general, the spec kind of has low damage, so this helps us better maintain threat on our enemies. Our second talent is going to be Wild Charge. Now, this talent gives us a versatile mobility tool, letting us leap forwards, backwards to allies or enemies based on our shapeshift form. Our next talent is going to be Restoration Affinity. Now, this talent has our Guardian Druid embrace the Restoration Druid spec as well, giving us some extra healing potential. This gives us a passive that heals us for 3% of our maximum HP every 5 seconds. If we are at full health, though, an injured party member is healed by this passive instead. In addition, this gives us access to 3 strong heals that we could use while we're in caster form, and it gives us a CC that can be used in all forms called Ursul's Vortex. This spell slows enemy movement speed, and for the first time they try to move away from the vortex, it automatically pulls them back in. Our next talent is going to be Mighty Bash, giving us a strong single target stun that lasts for 4 seconds and is usable in all shapeshift forms. Our next talent is one of my favorites, Incarnation, Guardian of Ursoc. Now, this talent turns our Berserk into a much stronger version of itself. It reduces the cooldown of Mangle, Thrash, Growl, and Frenzied Regeneration by 75% and reduces the cost of Iron Fur by 50%. Now, I'm going to explain all of these skills in the rotation section, but these are just basically all of our important skills. In addition, Incarnation also increases our maximum HP by 30% and makes Mangle hit up to 3 targets. Now, Incarnation is a very strong defensive cooldown and makes you almost immortal while it is up. Our next talent is going to be Earth Warden. Now, this talent makes it so that when you deal direct damage with Thrash, you gain a charge of this talent, reducing the damage of your next auto attack that you would take by 30%, having up to 3 charges. Our final regular talent is going to be Rend and Tear. Now, this talent makes it so that each stack of Thrash reduces the target's damage to us by 2% and increases our damage to those opponents by 2%. And remember, this can stack up to 3 times for 6% on each. If you do choose to PvP on the Guardian Druid, these are the talents I'd recommend, with the first one being Den Mother, giving all allies within 15 yards of us 15% additional HP. Our next talent is going to be an active, Demoralizing Roar. This makes it so that when we use it, all enemies within 10 yards deal 20% reduced damage for 8 seconds. Finally, I recommend Toughness, which reduces the duration of all stuns on us by 25%, making us much more difficult to lock down. Now, Guardian Druid is one of my favorite tank specs, and the spec is relatively straightforward to play and incredibly tanky, although it's a bit weak to magical damage. Now, while playing Guardian, your goal is simply going to be to maintain Moonfire on targets that you are fighting and use Mangle, which is a single target damage dealing ability that generates Rage to generate Rage. You'll also use Thrash, which is an AoE bleed that can stack up to 3 times to deal damage to all enemies that interact with our talents, since we have a ton of talents that are based on this skill. You then simply want to spend the Rage generated on Iron Fur to increase your armor and make you even tankier. This effect can also stack, and the more stacks of Iron Fur you have, the higher your armor is and the tankier you are. Now, if you're losing health and you need to heal, you'll spend the Rage on Frenzied Regeneration. If you're not taking as much damage, nor do you need to heal yourself, you can spend Rage on Maul to deal some extra damage. Now, if your Mangle and Thrash are on cooldown, you have no rage to spend, and Moonfire is already up, you're going to fill globals with Swipe. You also want to make sure to use Mangle whenever you get a Gore proc, as this Mangle will generate extra rage. Now, for some offensive notes for the Guardian Druid, you want to use Mighty Bash to stun problematic enemies, taking them out of the fight for a short time. You want to use Skull Bash to interrupt important spell casts. You want to use Ursul's Vortex to slow enemies' movement speed and make it so that the first time they try to move away from the Vortex, they're pulled back to the center. Use Incapacitating Roar to CC groups of enemies around you, incapacitating them for a short time. Keep in mind that this will break on damage. Finally, use Entangling Roots to root problematic enemies in their place, but keep in mind this is not usable while in bear form. For some defensive notes, if you're going to take a big hit or taking a little too much damage, use Barkskin. This low cooldown ability reduces the damage taken by 20% for 12 seconds and strengthens your Brambles talent. If taking a lot of extra damage, however, you're going to want to use Survival Instincts. Now, this skill reduces damage taken by 50% for 6 seconds. Thankfully, you have 2 charges of this skill. If you just need to become an immortal juggernaut in certain situations, or you just need a lot of extra healing and mitigation, you want to use Incarnation. During this time, all of the primary skills that I mentioned in the rotation are going to have a reduced cost and cooldown, on top of gaining 30% extra health and making Mangle AoE. You'll be able to deal a lot of damage, heal for a ton, and stack your Iron Fur up really high. Use Soothe to remove an enrage effect from an enemy. You can use Cyclone to CC enemies that are problematic for 6 seconds, because during that time, they can't deal or receive any damage or healing. Hibernate can be used to put Beast or Dragonkin type enemies to sleep for a long period of time, but keep in mind the CC will also break on damage. Now, you also do have access to Stealth while you're in cat form. This can be useful to bypass enemies that you do not want to engage with. You can also deal damage while in cat form with Shred, Rip, and Ferocious Bite if you're so inclined. If your allies need some extra healing and you're not actively tanking, like in a raid, you can feel free to pop out of bear form and use Rejuvenation, Swift Med, and Wild Growth to heal your allies, which you got from Restoration Affinity. Dash is a really good tool to move around the battlefield quickly, but do keep in mind this does automatically put you in cat form where you are not as tanky. Stampeding Roar is a powerful tool that gives your party a big movement speed boost, having everyone move 60% faster for 8 seconds. Wild Charge can be used in a variety of ways based on what the situation calls for. You can use it in caster form to leap back to an ally, cat form to get behind an enemy, bear form to charge to and root an enemy, moonkin form to leap backwards, or travel form to leap forwards. You can also use Remove Corruption to remove curses and poisons from yourself or allies. Now, in terms of a secondary stat priority for the Guardian Druid, I personally recommend going Versatility, Mastery, Haste, and then Critical Strike. In terms of Shadowlands specific information, I do recommend the Necrolord Covenant for the Guardian Druid. And for your recommended legendary, I recommend Memory of Ursoc's Fury Remembered. Now, for our final spec, we have the healing spec, the Restoration Druid, with our first talent being Abundance. This talent makes it so that for each rejuvenation we have active, which is one of our primary hots, Regrowth, which is another one of our primary heals, has its cost reduced by 6% and critical chance increased by 6%. Our second talent is going to be Tiger Dash. Now, this talent gives us an incredibly powerful movement speed skill, having a shift into cat form and moving at 200% increased movement speed which gradually reduces over 5 seconds. Our next talent is going to be Balance Affinity. This gives our Restoration Druid more of the powers of the Balance Druid specialization as well, giving us some offensive prowess. While we gain Moonkin form and some Battle Druid skills, we don't really use them. We mainly take this talent for the passive bonus to increase the range of all of our abilities by 5 yards, making it easier for us to maintain uptime on our enemies and allies. We also do gain Typhoon, which allows us to knock back and slow enemies. Our next talent is going to be Mass Entanglement. Now, this gives us a really strong AoE root tool, allowing us to remove all enemies within, allowing us to root all enemies within 15 yards of our target for 30 seconds. Keep in mind that the damage may break this effect. Our next talent is going to be Incarnation Tree of Life. Now, this talent gives us an incredibly strong emergency cooldown, having us transform into the Tree of Life for 30 seconds, which increases our healing done by 15%, gives us 120% increased armor, and prevents us from being polymorphed. In addition, Rejuvenation, Wild Growth, Regrowth, and Entangling Roots are all enhanced, which is basically all of our main heals and our single target root. Our next talent is going to be Spring Blossoms. Now, this talent makes our Efflorescence, which is an AoE hot, grant a second hot for 6 seconds, increasing the throughput of this skill pretty dramatically. Our next talent is going to be Photosynthesis. Now, this makes it so that while we have Life Bloom, one of our other primary hots, on ourselves, our hots heal 20% faster. While the skill is on an ally, our hots have a 4% chance to cause the skill to bloom, which basically will proc for a strong instant heal. Now, if you do choose to PvP on the Restoration Druid, these are the talents I'd recommend, with the first one being Thorns. Now, this gives us an active ability that makes it so that melee opponents who attack us will have nature damage reflected back at them for 12 seconds. Attackers will also have their movement speed reduced by 50% for 4 seconds. Our next talent is going to be Focused Growth. Now, this talent reduces the cost of Life Bloom by 8%, and our Life Bloom now applies Focused Growth to the target, which increases Life Bloom's healing by 8%, stacking up to 3 times. Our next talent is going to be Reactive Resin. Now, this talent makes it so that casting Rejuvenation grants the target 2 charges of Reactive Resin, which heals the target after they receive a melee crit and increases the duration of Rejuvenation for an additional 3 seconds. Now, in terms of actually playing the Restoration Druid, when playing Resto, you basically want to maintain HOTS on your allies to make sure that as they're taking damage, your heals will be healing them back up. Since Life Bloom can only be active on one target at a time, you're generally going to want to put this on your tank, which will cause them to gain the benefit of the Photosynthesis talent. You're going to want to maintain Efflorescence on the ground because it's like a ground AoE heal at all times. Typically, you'll place this in melee range, so melee will get the heal in addition to your tank. As people start taking damage, you're going to want to place Rejuvenations on them to give them some healing over time. If multiple members start taking damage, you're going to want to cast Wild Growth to make sure that everyone is being healed from this, as this hot heals up to 6 allies within 30 yards. If someone needs instant spot healing, you want to use Swiftmen to consume a hot to give them a big heal, and then reapply the hot when they start taking damage again. You want to use Regrowth as an emergency heal when Swiftmen is on cooldown and whenever you get a clear casting proc. Clear casting has a chance to happen when Life Bloom heals, which makes your next Regrowth free. If you don't need to heal anyone, just use Wrath to fill globals and deal some extra damage. Now, in terms of some offensive notes, if you want to pump out a major amount of healing, you're going to want to use Incarnation to greatly increase your healing throughput. Use Mass Entanglement or Entangling Roots to root problematic enemies in their place. Typhoon can be used to push back and slow enemies. It's really helpful to move dungeon and raid enemies into more favorable positions for your group. Now, if your entire raid needs emergency healing, you're going to want to use Tranquility to help heal everyone back up to full. If someone is taking a heavy amount of damage, you're going to want to use Iron Bark on them, to reduce their damage taken by 20% and increase their healing from HOTS received by 20% for 12 seconds. Nature's Swiftness can be used if you need to cast a big Regrowth for free in a pinch. This can also be used to cast Rebirth, which is a battle resurrection, instantly if you need someone revived quickly. It can also be used on Entangling Roots as well, but I think it's better served on one of the other skills. Tiger Dash is really good to move around the battlefield quickly. Keep in mind that this will put you into cat form where you cannot use your heals. Use Innervate on yourself or another friendly healer to allow them to be able to cast their skills with no mana cost for a period of time. Use Nature's Cure to cleanse an ally of all magic, curse, and poison effects. Use Soothe to remove an enrage effect from an enemy. You could also use Cyclone as a powerful CC to remove problematic enemies from the fight for 6 seconds, because during this time they cannot deal or receive any damage or healing. Use Bark Skin if you start taking a lot of damage to reduce the damage that you take by 20% for 12 seconds. Hibernate can also be used to put Beast or Dragon Kid type enemies to sleep for a long period of time, but keep in mind the CC will break on damage. You want to utilize Bear Form if you're taking a lot of damage and need to make yourself tankier while your HOTS heal you. You can utilize Mangle to generate Rage to cast on Ironfur to give yourself extra armor. Keep in mind that you can't use your heals in this form. You have access to Stealth while you're in cat form. This can be useful to bypass enemies that you don't want to engage with, and you can also deal damage while in cat form with Shred and Ferocious Bite. While questing, you can use Moonkin form to use skills like Starfire, Star Surge, Sunfire, and Moonfire to deal damage to your enemies, since we are using the Balance Affinity. You still have access to Regrowth as a heal too while you're in this form. Finally, Stampeding Roar is a powerful movement tool for your party, giving them 60% movement speed for 8 seconds. In terms of secondary stat priority, Haste is by far your most important stat, followed by basically Mastery, Crit, and Versatility all being about the same. In terms of some Shadowlands specific information, I do recommend using Night Fae as your Covenant. Refer to the Balanced Druid section if you want to, hear a bit more about this skill and what this long-ass tooltip actually means. And then finally, for your recommended Legendary, I recommend using Memory of an Unending Growth. But guys, with that is going to be it for me today. The final video in my World of Warcraft beginner class guides. I hope you guys did enjoy these, and if you guys want to take a look at any of the other class videos, you can find them on my YouTube channel or on my website, dotsgaming.com. And if you found the Druid video helpful today, I'd appreciate it if you left a like on it. Any questions about Druids, feel free to leave a comment below. And if you guys want to keep up to date with the World of Warcraft content I put out here on my YouTube channel, please hit that sub button as well as hit the bell to keep notifications on. So thank you all so much for stopping by today. I very much appreciate it. As always, I'm Dots Gaming, and I'll see you all in the next one.